All right, so this last PowerPoint, we're going to kind of discuss the end of the Cold War, a little bit about Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, and then we're also going to, the Soviet collapse, and then we're also going to discuss some of the wars that occur afterwards because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then mainly nationalist wars, and then we're going to end with kind of the creation of the global economy, kind of what our whole class has been leading up to. And by the 1990s, 2000s, the global economy has taken full force. So Mikhail Gorbachev was elected the secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1985, and he was by far the youngest for many generations. The three guys before him, Brezhnev, Chernenko, and Andropov, all were older men, and they all died within 3 years of each other. So the brass and the Communist Party didn't want that to happen again. So they elected this younger man, Mikhail Gorbachev, as their secretary, which would basically be the prime minister, so to speak. When he got to power, the country was in a severe stagnation. They had deep economic and political problems, and all of these things needed to be addressed and overcome. So, recognizing this, Gorbachev introduced a two-tier policy of reform. On one level, he began a program of economic reform known as perestroika, or rebuilding. It's more closely known as restructuring. And on the second level, he introduced glasnost, which in Russian basically means openness. And what this openness really meant was freedom of speech. Unfortunately, as we will see, it didn't work like he wanted it to, but in fact, this is the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. But it worked like it worked well enough because it gave people the opportunity to say what they wanted to, and all of these deep-seated resentments and political and economic issues really came to the forefront, which is what he wanted in a sense, but in another sense, he didn't want the complete collapse of the Soviet Union. But to go a little deeper into these two, perestroika really was about allowing some market-like reforms, kind of like the new economic policy we talked about in the USSR, or kind of what China was doing in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. Gorbachev does the same in Russia. This wasn't supposed to be the end of the command economy or totalitarianism, so to speak, in the Soviet Union, but it was an attempt to make socialism more efficient and more pragmatic, and to really meet the needs of consumers, especially consumers in Russia and the Eastern Bloc of Europe, because it was severely noticeable that people in many of the Soviet republics didn't have refrigerators, didn't have heaters, even things that we take for granted like microwaves were a huge commodity back then, and it was evident. People knew this. People knew people in the West had these things, and they wanted these things. And Gorbachev sets out these reforms to try to get these kind of things going. Along with perestroika, he also sees the persecution of religion. It was no longer illegal to be a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Hindu or anything in the Soviet Union, and he also allowed the publishing of previously banned books, books that talk about totalitarianism, such as books you've probably read, George Orwell's 1984 or Animal Farm, Dr. Zhivago, one of the greatest books about the Russian Revolution ever, one of my favorite books of all time, was not allowed. Things like Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler, We by Yevgeny Semyotin, all of these anti-totalitarian books, they're actually letting them into the USSR for the first time. And what went along with this perestroika is the glasnost, which is openness. This openness, the main goal of the policy was to make the country's government more transparent and open to debate. most of the decisions that were made in the Soviet Union were made by a small number of communist members who are known as apparatchiks. Not a lot of people had a lot of say in the Soviet Union. So Gorbachev kind of wanted this. He kind of wanted this to be opened up a little bit. He wanted the people to have more say in their government. He also gave the freedom of speech, which was very important because, as you'll see, as we'll talk about, freedom of speech, especially in the Baltic states and Transcaucasia, and all of these places where communism goes down quickly. A lot of it has to do with the freedom of speech, and this was a radical change, as control of speech and suppression and the media were a big part of the Soviet government's control. And really, like I said, this went far beyond what Gorbachev had intended, and this changed many citizens' views towards the government, right? Once people kind of found out what was going on in their government to a certain extent, and they were allowed to talk about it, especially in the media, and get that out, people were shocked at what was going on. And it really did, this idea of freedom of speech really did hurt the communist government in a lot of ways. I don't have it in this slide, but he also came up with the Gorbachev doctrine, which he called the Sinatra doctrine, because he gave kind of funny, because Sinatra sings the song My Way, and basically what Gorbachev said is anybody who is living, and this is a little later, but this also has the same intended effect. This is like 87, 88, 89. He says anybody who wants to have free elections and wants to break off from the Soviet Union and create your own government, you're allowed to. And to his surprise, at the time, in hindsight, it doesn't seem that surprising, but to his surprise, immediately the disintegration of the Soviet Union began on the peripheries, in the non-Russian areas, and this is what people call, he opened Pandora's national box, so to speak. The first region to really, this is probably around early 1987, so by mid-1987, places in the Baltic states began to produce these massed organized dissents against the communist government, especially Estonia. The Baltic state of Estonia demanded autonomy, and Lithuania and Latvia, the two other Baltic states, quickly followed suit and said, yeah, we want to be independent. And this was a strong challenge to Gorbachev, because he did not think that this was going to happen. But he, at the same time, he didn't want to crack down too severely on these participants, because he had already told people that they should have their own, begin to start forming their own governments, and if they wanted to. But at the same time, he didn't believe that this would spell such a disaster for the Soviet Union like it was going to. I mean, the Soviet Union was, by 87, 88, was collapsing in front of his eyes, and in front of the world's eyes. And then after Estonia, similar movements spring up all over the what we would consider the former Soviet Union today. In the Transcaucasus region, this is in the south of Soviet Union. This would be Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, kind of on the Black and the Baltic Seas, that area there. They also began talking about being ethnically united within their republic, saying we're not part of the Soviet Union anymore, we're Armenian, or we're Azerbaijan, Azeri, we're Georgian, we are not Soviets. And so all of these, once Pandora's box was opened, all of these countries, republics, start having these national movements emerge. Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarusia, many of the Central Asian republics, what my brother-in-law calls the stands, right? Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, all of these places are, Afghanistan, as we talked about the war, Afghanistan was not a part of the Soviet Union, but the stands out there. And like I've already said before, Gorbachev and the Communist Party's eyes, their their whole collapse, the collapse was happening around them. And so things finally came to a head in August of 1991, and in a last-ditch effort to save the Soviet Union, these hardline communists organized a coup against Gorbachev to throw him out. They kidnapped him. And then on August 19th of 1991, they announced on state television that Gorbachev was very ill and would no longer be able to govern, right? So the country went into an uproar. Massive protests were staged in Moscow, Leningrad, other large cities. And then when the coup organizers, who were a lot of hardliners, who a lot of them had ties to the military, when they tried to bring in the military to quell all the protesters in Moscow and all of these large cities, Kiev, throughout, the soldiers themselves rebelled, saying that they wouldn't fire on their fellow countrymen. So after 3 days of protests, the coup organizers surrendered, and they realized that without the cooperation of the whole military, this wouldn't work, and they didn't have the power to overcome the population of the whole country. Very reminiscent, right, of the first Russian Revolution, right? Tsar Nicholas II asked the military to put down a coup or, riots. The military says no. Within a few months, Tsar Nicholas is kicked out. But after the failed coup attempt, by December of 1991, the Soviet Union was in such dire straits, and it was completely collapsing, that both the government and the people realized that there was no way to turn back the clock. And the August days, those massive demonstrations had shown that the population was ready for democracy, and that's the only thing that they would accept. And even though Gorbachev is kind of seen as this democrat and this guy who brings democracy and capitalism to the Soviet Union, he was at heart still a Leninist Marxist, right? He was a hardline communist. He just realized that in order to get the Soviet Union out of a stagnant economy, he needed to implement a few capitalistic ideals, and give and make people happy, give them freedom of religion, allow them to have some of the things that people in the West have. He needed a quiescent population, and he tried that. But so even though we think of him as a guy who brought democracy to the Soviet Union, he actually did, but that was not his intention. So on December 25th, 1991, on Christmas Day, 1991, the Soviet Union officially collapses. Gorbachev concedes power, and he resigns on Christmas Day. By January of 1992, by popular demand, the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, and in its place, a new entity was formed, and it was called the Commonwealth of Independent Republics. It's also known as the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States, and it was composed of most of the independent countries of the former Soviet Union, so places like Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, these places like that. And these members all had complete political independence, but they were linked to other Commonwealth countries by economics and, in some case, military ties. So it's kind of like the European Union in a sense, although Russia was still the main. The actual Republic of Russia was still the main leader of the CIS. And so what happened after this is kind of recent history that maybe some of you remember or have lived through. And what is happening even into today is a lot of these republics are still having problems developing their economies, reorganizing their political systems, and in a lot of places settling bitter territorial disputes. There was an enormous amount of ethnic wars going on in these areas. People in Armenia didn't want to be in Armenia. People who were in Azerbaijan there are a lot of Armenians in Azerbaijan, and they wanted their own republic. Georgia's fought with Ossetias, North and South Ossetias. We'll talk about the Chechen Wars. All of these are and we'll talk about Yugoslavia. When Yugoslavia breaks down, the same thing happens there. And I'm sure you guys have heard of some of the people we'll talk about. So like we said, that was kind of how the Soviet Union collapsed in a nutshell. That's a very quick thing, but really it was a lot of people argue that it was Ronald Reagan who kind of outspent the Soviet Union and caused their economy to collapse. I guess in a sense that may be true. There's debates on whether that worked or not. There's no question that Ronald Reagan upped the military spending to higher than any time in the history of the United States. But a lot of people argue that even if he had not done that, the decay and the stagnation of the economies in the 80s and the absolute dislike for the Soviet Union was a tinderbox. At some point, these people were going to rebel. It took a guy like Gorbachev saying, yeah, have a little free speech, have a little, freedom of religion, and then that's the match that really lit the fire that started the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not to say that Ronald Reagan wasn't a large part of this. Him and Gorbachev had very good relations, and Ronald Reagan was a very, very good Cold Warrior. But at the same time, he should not get all the credit, because a lot of it had to do with the internal descent of the Soviet Union. There's a map of the Balkans and former Yugoslavia on your next slide, so if you want to look at that, you can every once in a while, because we'll be talking a lot about these places, and it's kind of hard to visualize where they are sometimes. What ends up happening with the breakup of the Soviet Union, and essentially the Yugoslavia follows shortly thereafter, is just the absolute mayhem that ensues over national lines, ethnic territories, religion, all kinds, just all kinds of things that happen when people are living so close together who are so different and dislike each other so long, and with no strong central government to keep them peaceful in a sense. Things really begin to spiral quickly. They think in these wars, total deaths are probably around 400,000 people, and another 4 million people were displaced. And a lot of these people are civilians. And I don't know, that I guess when you look at it in terms of World War II, that's not a lot of people, but the Balkans are not a large area. And this was very intense dislike for each other that made it so that civilians were definitely targeted, and there was a lot of ethnic cleansing going on. But in the 1980s, before the breakup, the relations had deteriorated. Slovenia and Croatia were desiring greater autonomy, while Serbia wanted to strengthen federal authority. Serbia is kind of the largest of the countries here, so throughout history, Serbia has really tried to dominate the Balkans in a sense, not necessarily in a bad way. It's just that Serbia has been the largest area in the Balkans for a very long time. Tensions had begun to amount, but by 1990 it proved that this was the decisive point. There was a lot of economic hardship, and Yugoslavia, just like the Soviet Union, was facing rising nationalism among its various ethnic groups. So by the early 1990s, with the collapse kind of the totalitarian economy, there were no effective authorities at the federal level. What really is the federal presidency consisted of the representatives of the 6 republics, the 2 provinces in the area, and the Yugoslav People's Army, which is the JNA. And so the leadership, the conglomerate of these people, it was very split along national lines. All right, so the communist leadership was divided along national lines, even though the whole idea of communism was that there would be no national lines. This just it just wasn't impossible. It was impossible not to in Yugoslavia. Um, at the time in 1990, a man you've probably heard of, Slobodan Milosevic, he kind of starts to gain power as representatives of places like Kosovo and Montenegro start to begin replaced with people loyal to him, who at the time he was the actual elected president of Serbia in 1990. This way, through wrangling and alliances and other things, Serbia had secured 4 out of the 8 federal presidency votes. And so they were able to influence decision-making at the federal level, since all of the other Yugoslav republics only had 1 vote. At the same time, Milosevic demanded even more central federation and Serbia's dominant role in it. Places like Slovenia and Croatia and Bosnia and Kosovo, and they were saying, no, we don't want this to occur. But Slobodan Milosevic is starting to gain power because he was a very good politician, and they begin to get this dominant role in the presidency of the Yugoslavia. So in January of 1990, the Dominated Assembly agrees to abolish the single-party system. However, Milosevic used his influence to block and vote down all the other proposals from the Croatians and the Slovenes, and this prompted the Croatians and the Slovenes to walk out and thus break up the party, which was basically the end of what the Yugoslavs would consider to be the Communist Party in Yugoslavia. And really this whole idea of the brotherhood and unity of the Communist Party by the end of 1990 was really awash. Basically, Slobodan Milosevic was in power. So with Slovenia and Croatia mad at Milosevic, they declare independence in 1991, and the Yugoslav federal government, which is still considered the Yugoslav federal government, attempted to forcibly halt the breakup of the country, declaring that the secessions of Slovenia and Croatia were illegal and contrary to the constitution of Yugoslavia. And so the Yugoslav federal government, with the JNA, was used to secure the integral unity of Yugoslavia. And so this is when the 10-day war begins. The first of all of these conflicts, because there was a lot of wars, was initiated by the JNA in June of 1991 after the secession of Slovenia. So the Yugoslav National Army under Slobodan Milosevic, who's a Serb and who's supposedly leading the communist federal government, so to speak, he goes into Slovenia and says, you cannot secede from our union. Slovenian police and their what they would consider the territorial defense blockaded barracks and roads, and there were standoffs and limited skirmishes around the republic. After only a couple dozen casualties or so, the conflict was stopped through negotiations on July 9th, 1991, when Slovenia and Croatia agreed to a 3-month moratorium on secession. So Slovenia and Croatia said, okay, we won't, let's give us 3 months so we can think about seceding. And so the federal army completely withdrew from Slovenia by October. What happened after the 10-day war, and kind of during, skirmishes kind of happened during the 10-day war, and it really comes to a head afterwards, is the Croatian War of Independence. And this begins when the Serbians in Croatia, who were opposed to Croatian independence, announced their secession from Croatia. So that's kind of, it's kind of hard to explain, but at the same time, just because you lived in Croatia didn't make you a Croat. and so there were a lot of Serbs living in Croatia, and they did not want to become independent from the federal government because Slobodan Milosevic, who is a Serb, was the leader of the government, right? So what happens is the JNA comes in, and it was the JNA. It's even though it was supposedly a federal force from all 6 different republics. Its officer corps was predominantly staffed by Serbs or Montenegrins at about 70%. So as a result, the JNA also opposed Croatian independence and sided with the Croatian Serb rebels. Okay, so the Croatian Serb rebels were, they had an arms embargo and imposed on them by the UN, but this didn't really hurt them because the UN did not want another war to break out, so they had imposed an embargo on the Serbian Croats, hopefully so they wouldn't go to war. But instead what ends up happening is the JNA backs the Croatian Serbs anyways, and they are unaffected by the embargo because they had complete support and access supplies of the JNA. So by mid-July 1991, the JNA had moved an estimated 7,000 troops to Croatia. And kind of after the 10-day war, fighting really, really escalated, eventually spanning hundreds of miles from western Slovenia through to Dalmatia. If you can look at a map, I think the map is on there, but it was a very large and intense battle, and this was this was heavy fighting, and many of the border regions faced direct attacks from forces within Serbia and Montenegro, right? So people were invading, and the killing didn't just stay in the Bosnian borders. I mean, there was killings throughout the area. People were siding with other people. Some people were siding with Croats. Some people were siding with the Serbs. It's a very large and intense war in a small area, and it had a lot of architectural damage. This is a picture from the Croatian War, actually. The damage architecturally was devastating. This is when a lot of people were rounded up and ethnically cleansed in concentration camps. This is where Slobodan Milosevic gets his bad name. Also in the Bosnian War, but this is the Croatian War is kind of the start. Excuse me. Kind of the start of these ideals of ethnic cleansing that goes on throughout. Meanwhile, a year later, the Bosnian War occurs, and this happens from 1992 to 1995. Control over central Croatia was seized by the Croatian Serb forces with the JNA. So even though the Croatian War is still goes on until 1995, in 1992, the JNA had control of Croatia. And they were under the leadership of Ratko Mladic. I don't know if you've heard of this man, but Ratko Mladic is a very, very big war criminal. He was brutal. He was charged in The Hague after the wars for killing captured soldiers, opening fire on civilians, amongst other things, and a lot of this has to do with religion. Serbs are Christians and Bosniaks are Muslims. So a lot of the really nasty stuff starts happening in the Bosnian War because it's not only is it an ethnic war, but it's also a religious war. Now, Croats are Catholics, so Serbs are Orthodox Christians. So even though they're not the same, they're still Christians. A lot of bad things happened in the Croatian War, but in the Bosnian War, and it was territorial as well, in the Bosnian War, things got really nasty because it was ethnic, it was religious, and it was about land. And so I don't know if you've heard of Slobodan Milosevic or Ratko Mladic, one of his main generals, but this is the area. These are the times when they're really known for the bad things that has occurred. What ends up happening is after years of war, by 1995, the war is kind of bearing down, and the United States and NATO and the UN and all of these people are trying to get in there to see what's going on and who's doing the bad things. And by April 1995, the CIA reported that probably about 90% of all the atrocities in the Yugoslav wars up to that point had been committed by Serb militants. And most of these had occurred in Bosnia. And what I'm talking about is, waking people up at night who were Muslims and hurting them, civilians, hurting them into, very, very Nazi-ish, early Stalinish type of behavior, rounding people up and putting them in a line and shooting all of them, women, children, men, raping, pillaging, a lot of the bad things that occur in wars when civilians are involved happened in Bosnia, and almost all of it were committed by Serb militants. So in 1994, the U.S. brokers peace between Croatia and Bosnia, who were also fighting each other, and then in 1994, the NATO actually starts bombing Bosnian Serbs, and really this was actually quite the bombing of the Croatian Serbs was very important, not only for the Bosnian War but also for the Croatian War. The bombing actually got the Serbs to the negotiating table in 1995, and this was Bill Clinton's idea of a NATO strike, and it was actually quite effective. And also, at the same time, the UN came in and they really pressured all sides to really get to a ceasefire and negotiate an end to the war in Bosnia. By 1995, NATO bombing had been so good that the Croatian War was over. By the summertime, the Serbs had gone to the table and brokered a peace, and the Croatian War had ended with the Serbs and the JNA leaving Croatia at the time. But the Bosnian War was still going on, and so pressure was put on all sides to negotiate an end to that. And with NATO's help and with Clinton's help, the war ended on the 14th of December of 1995 with the Dayton agreements, and and basically what the Dayton agreement did was formed a republic within Bosnia and Herzegovina that could house Bosnian Serbs, right? So so they kind of got their independence in a sense. It's not a politically independent entity, but the republic is filled with Bosnian Serbs, so they did get a piece of land. They just didn't get all of Bosnia, which they were trying to do at the beginning of the war. And then these are all very complicated wars, and we're just kind of brushing over them. When war crimes and ethnic cleansing and rape and murder and nationalities and ethnicities and all of these bad things that happen in wars like this occur, it gets very complicated, and who's siding with who when a lot of ethnicities and nationalities are all in this hodgepodge fighting each other. Some Bosniaks were on the Serb side, some Croats were on the Serb side, some Serbs fought for Bosniaks. It's just a very, very complicated structure, and that's why NATO and the United States and the United Nations actually came in and helped deal with a lot of this, because it was really nasty, and a lot of the areas were completely devastated. because of this. Lastly, real quickly, we'll go through the Kosovo War, and you guys may also have heard of this. This is also one where NATO and Bill Clinton steps in. After its autonomy was quashed, Kosovo was faced with Kosovars were faced with state-organized oppression. Kosovo is another hard area because since the early 1990s, the Albanian language radio and television were restricted and newspapers were shut down, even though many Albanians lived in Kosovo. So this is another thing where Kosovar Albanians were living in a place that they had not, and there were a lot of them, were not giving the religious and the political and economic freedom that they should have gotten living in a place, but the place was not theirs. It was for Kosovars. So the Albanians began to get fired from public enterprises and institutions, banks, hospitals, post office, schools, colleges, and a lot of these jobs began going to Serbs. Albanians were prevented from entering school premises in 1991, and if you were an Albanian student, you were forced to not go to school by the early 1990s. So Serbs and Kosovars had begun, and mostly Serbs had come into Kosovar Serbians had come into Kosovo and had taken over that republic as well, and they were trying to kick Albanians out. It was definitely another move of kind of what we would consider to be ethnic cleansing, but it starts really politically and economically and socially. They're saying kind of get out of this country, and they're very suppressed, or republic I should say. So the Albanians started an insurgency in 1996, and really armed clashes really begin to break out in early 1998, and right away NATO gets involved with this one. They've seen what happened before, and they said this cannot go on again. So quickly they get in. They sign a ceasefire in about 2 months after the war begins, but both sides break this, and break the ceasefire, and fighting resumes. Really what happened was 45 Albanians were massacred in late 1998, and it was found out in January of 1999 they were massacred, and so that NATO decided that the conflict could only be settled by military peacekeeping force to forcibly restrain the two sides from massacring and killing each other. So, and at the same time, the Yugoslav presidency, Slobodan Milosevic, says we don't want NATO to come in at all. So NATO says, well, we're going to do it by force if we have to, but we're coming in and we're not going to let people massacre each other again. So basically what ends up happening is I don't know if you guys remember General Wesley Clark. He was the guy who was under the command of the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. And after 2 months of bombing, hostilities end in what is called the Kumanovo Agreement, which means Kosovo was placed under the government control of the United Nations and under the military protection of the Kosovo Force. Okay, so the United Nations kind of takes over Kosovo. And what ends up happening in this 15-month war is thousands of civilians were killed on both sides, and over a million were displaced. At the same time, the United Nations Security Council had imposed an embargo on the Serbs, on all of these Yugoslav republics. Obviously, it didn't work very well, but people were trying to stop these wars. The war crimes were extensive. War rape occurred as a matter of official orders as part of ethnic cleansing to displace the targeted ethnic group. Such ethnic cleansing is targeting a certain group and trying to clean the republic of them. So like the Albanians were targets. Supposedly during the Bosnian War there were rape camps set up aimed at creating very, very Nazi-like trying to create as many Serb children as possible to make up their society because the children inherit their father's ethnicity. Um, like I talked about, torture, enslavement. There was evidence of mass murders, mass massacres where they just round people up and kind of put them in corrals like cattle and just open fire on them. Um, many things, and what ends up happening is there's a war tribunal afterwards, and a lot of these guys like Slobodan Milosevic and Ratko Mladic, a lot of these guys, Stepan Radic is another guy. All of these men are tried for extensive war crimes, and the problem with all of these wars is, even though they're not going on today and it's very low intensity, a lot of these places still have underneath, even though all of these wars were kind of put to rest, there's still, even into today, this unrest between all of these ethnicities and religions, because there's not a lot of land down there and there's a lot of people. And even into today, people, you know, have feelings one way or the other, very, very much like Israel and Palestine. Okay, so real quick, I'll give you an example of kind of what this national question did in the actual Russian Federation. And this kind of echoes into today because obviously the people who did the bombing in Boston, Massachusetts last year were Chechens. And also for the Winter Olympics that are coming up, which are in Sochi, which are on the Georgian border and only about 2 hours from the Chechen border, a lot of these Chechens have um, said that they're going to do things at the Olympics. So, kind of what happened in Boston and what's going on now in the world, and a lot that happened before and after 9/11. Actually, quite a bit of that has to do with Chechnya itself. Um, Real quickly, we'll just go through it, and I just want to give this example of of the national question that really haunted the Soviet Union after its dissolution. So when the Soviet Union dissolved, the RSFSR, which is basically the Russian Federation, was created, and this is the largest republic. This is what we would consider to be Russia today. Now, Chechnya is in the southwestern border of the Russian Federation, and when the Soviet Union dissolved, they declared their independence from the Russian Federation. They are part of the Russian Federation even into today. Um, and the independence was claimed by this man named Johar Dudayev. Uh, that's an interesting name because I believe one of the bombers in the marathon last year's name was Johar. Um, so what he was actually an ex Soviet Union Air Force general, and he was Chechen, so he comes back to Chechnya at the dissolution of the USSR, kind of this dapper man, kind of dandyish looking, wears bow ties and a hat, and actually was one of the biggest organized criminals in the world in the 90s, but you would never notice it from him. So they declare independence, and what happens from 1991 to 1994 is complete mayhem in Chechnya. It becomes like this huge mass transit place for organized crime and drugs. It was kind of on the borderlands of Russia, and there was no real control. A lot of people argued it was kind of like the Wild West back in the day, people walking around with guns, showing off, young boys walking around with machine guns, walking down the street. It was a real rowdy time. It was kind of an open economic zone. People from Central Asia and China would fly in to Chechnya, to Grozny, with their drugs, and Grozny is the capital of Chechnya, and they would sell these on the open market for guns and things like that, and then they would head to the Middle East. It was kind of a transit spot. Then from there, the drugs would head up into Russia or into Western Europe, and even into Africa and the Middle East, and so it becomes this hodgepodge of criminal activity, really, and there's a real long story as to why Chechens are so good at being organized criminals. In fact, at the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they quickly take over Moscow and become one of the most powerful organized criminal syndicates in the world. Even the Russian gangsters are scared of them, and that tells you how scary the Chechens are. But anyways, so with them wanting independence and kind of this huge area of organized crime, the Boris Yeltsin decides to invade in 1994. They don't declare war because it's kind of Bill Clinton likened it to the American Civil War, right? There are people in the South who were trying to secede from people from the North, and so the United States did not get involved in this war, which made a lot of people mad. So what ends up happening is Boris Yeltsin invades in 1994, and from 1994 to 1996, they just completely bomb Grozny. A lot of people say that Grozny, and this is a picture of it right here. Here's a Russian soldier sitting at a table. I mean, this was the capital city. This was a very large city, and it was basically made into rubble. A lot of people argued it kind of looked like what Stalingrad looked like, or Dresden after World War II, after being bombed for months and months and months and months. They said people say it was a very World War II-esque looking place, and this was also very, very dirty, and there were massacres and there were rapes because Chechens are Muslims, and obviously Russians are Orthodox Christians. So there was also this kind of this tension between the two, and it was a fairly unpopular war. It was somewhat like Vietnam War in the sense that a lot of the soldiers didn't want to be there. The Chechens fought very tough. They're very tough individuals. They're well armed. The Russian army thought they would go in, bomb them. The Chechens would say, okay, we don't want to be independent, and then it would be over. But what ends up happening is a really brutal 2-year war. It culminates in the Battle of Grozny, which was just devastating. I mean, this is guerrilla warfare on a, like house-to-house kind of urban warfare that was just unreal. And finally, by 1996, it was so unpopular that Yeltsin just had to sign a peace treaty. So they declare a ceasefire in the end of 1996 at Kazaviyart. There's no real official accounting for death because civilians died, and then there's probably a lot of people who were never found. The Russians did have kind of these mopping cleanup crews that would come, and they would kind of call them cleanings in Russian, and they would go house by house and look for people who they thought were guerrilla warriors, right? So this was a very brutal war. Various figures estimate the number of civilian deaths in the first one at 30,000, 100,000, 30 to 100,000. See, this is the thing, is nobody really knows where a lot of these people are, so they're just presumed to be dead. And everybody was displaced, so they may not be dead, they may be living somewhere else now, but nobody really knows where all of these people. There's various figures. 200,000 injured, maybe. At least 500,000 were displaced, and cities and villages across the Republic were literally in ruins. It was a devastating war that really had no ending. It had a ceasefire. So what ends up happening at 1996 is kind of what happens in Afghanistan after the Soviet Union gets kicked out of Afghanistan. When the Russians leave Chechnya, all they have is this embattered, heavily armed population of pissed off people. And so what happens from 1996 to 1999 is this interregnum is just this free-for-all in Chechnya. And you have to understand, geopolitically, Chechnya is somewhat important because it's in between Russia and where they get a lot of their oil, or where they send their oil. There's a lot of pipelines in Chechnya down through Azerbaijan to the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, and even to the Middle East, right? So geopolitically, this is important. So what happens from 1996 to 1999 is just a free-for-all of crime and siphoning oil from the pipelines. There's no real government. But what ends up happening, which is important, especially for the world today, is from 1996 to 1999, things change from Chechens wanting independence to this mass Islamic, fundamental Islamic movement coming in, which we would call Islamism. And so the Second War, which starts in 1999, which is basically Vladimir Putin's first real thing that he does as president, right? Yeltsin steps down. Mysteriously, he says, I don't want to be president anymore. He says, but this guy's going to be president now, right? Very Soviet Union-like. Russia hasn't changed that much. And Putin's even trying to make it more into the Soviet Union. And so he says, by the way, here's this guy named Vladimir Putin who nobody knows who this guy is. And one of Putin's first acts is, I'm going to go down and I'm going to take care of all these terrorists who are living in Chechnya now. So in 1999, the Second Chechen War begins. And this time it's not a war of independence. This time it's a war, Putin even kind of calls it a war on terror. This is in 1999. This is 2 years before 9/11. He calls it this war on terror, and he actually asked the United States to help because he says, if you don't help us, they're training people, they're well armed, and a lot of people think Osama bin Laden was there for a while. A lot of Jordanians, a lot of Saudi rebels, a lot of mujahideen from Afghanistan are coming into Chechnya, and they were training at the facilities and creating this, trying to create this Islamic Republic, is what they were trying to do. And Vladimir Putin in 1999 says to the world, especially the West, when the West says, hey, you shouldn't go to war again, Vladimir Putin says, well, hey, these guys are training, and they're training for something. And he says, I'm fighting terror, and you guys are not. He says, this is the front line of terror. And little did he know how correct, well, he may have known, little did we know how correct he was. Right, so this is really the first war on terror, so to speak. But what ends up happening is the war was very high intensity. One of the main leaders, Shamil Basayev, he actually is killed in, I believe, 2003. He's killed by a bomb from the FSB. But before that, for about 9 or 10 years, Basayev really builds up this strong Islamic fundamentalist army of mujahideen in Chechnya, and they're fighting Russian forces, and they're training, and a lot of people who are training in other areas for Holy War come to Chechnya, and they fight and they train on the Russians. So it's kind of a mixed bag of people. It's not Chechens fighting Russians for independence anymore. It's mujahideen and holy warriors from all over the world who are coming in and looking for training and wanting to fight the infidel. And so that is happening in Chechnya today. And so that kind of gives you somewhat of a background as to maybe what those guys were thinking last April when they bombed the marathon in Boston. That's who these guys are. These guys probably grew up in this. I mean, I think they spent a lot of time in America, but at some point, they went back to Chechnya. They lived in Dagestan. They were fighting Russians. They got trained, or at least one of them did, right? So these are the people who Russia are fighting a low intensity conflict with, even into today. So that kind of gives you a background of how Putin got his rise, which he's obviously the president now, or prime minister, whichever one he wants to be, and kind of this whole idea of how this independent movement changed from actually wanting to be independent to this wanting to be an Islamic Republic, and where this fundamentalism really came from, especially in the Chechen sense, and then this transferred over into training and supplying other mujahideen throughout the world, and then even into last year, the attack on America. These guys were from Chechnya, and this is kind of the reason, or this could be one reason, why they decided to do what they did. And this is just one example of nationalist wars in the former Soviet Union. Like I said, there's some in Georgia, there's some in Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia, Azerbaijanis start fighting each other. I mean, this is just one example with the Yugoslav war of what really happens once the Soviet Union breaks up and all of these nationalities want their own independence. Like we've talked about, in revolutions like this, they're always violent, no matter what, even if it's for democracy. Right? Look at the Arab Spring, same thing. Revolutions usually violence ensues after them, and these are all very good examples of that. All right, we're just going to end on kind of what happens to the global economy after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. What ends up happening is a lot of these republics go down the road of capitalism or democracy or independence, whatever you want to call it, and expansion of trade between countries, foreign investment, and this unfettered movement of capital, which we call free trade, occurs. There's privatization of state companies, right? This is how these people in Russia get really rich. When the Soviet Union collapses, all of these state-owned mines, factories, for aluminum, gold, silver, anything that you can think of, they're sold for pennies on the dollar, and anybody who had a capital could buy these. And this is how these guys make just tons of money in the Soviet Union. And this is the emergence of corporations as well, and this is what we've talked about. This is what globalization is. Really what free trade is the freedom from state-imposed limits and constraints on trade across borders. So what ends up happening is things like the IMF, the Intermonetary Fund, which is International Monetary Fund, which is kind of a US-backed, UN-backed global bank, that when governments and entities like this that are looking for their independence or looking for democracy and they need loans, the IMF was set up for this particular reason. You also get the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, which has become a forum for settling international trade disputes, and it really does have the power to enforce these things. And by 1990, 1991, world trade had exceeded $6 trillion US, and with the breakup of the Soviet Union, this just skyrockets. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but it gets much, much larger. At the same time, we start getting global corporations. And what we're talking about here is multinational corporations, which means we call them MNCs for short. And these are companies who conduct their business in several nations, and they operate within specific laws and customs of these nations, and they really rely on small headquarters, and they're looking all over the globe for their best operating costs. And we talked about this early in the semester about globalization and outsourcing and looking for profit and things like that. This is really what these multinational corporations do. They really treat the world as if it's one state, not a bunch of nations. And they're, like we've talked about, there are goods and there are bads to this, right? So corporations like Siemens, GM, Nestle are global in the sense that they don't have a particular location, and they don't necessarily rely on the laws of a certain place, right? So if you're a Nestle factory in Indonesia, you don't have to follow United States factory laws. You have to follow Indonesian factory laws, things of that nature. And then a lot of these places that are developing, they want investment and they want infrastructure and they want factories and they want mines. So they'll give these companies tax breaks and other necessities that they need for very cheap in order to get these companies to come into their country. For instance, a lot of these companies that used to pay 30% of federal taxes in America, let's say GM, for instance, or GE, Coca-Cola, now they're down to 12%, right? So people are finding ways to circumvent certain things and to create a profit, which a lot of it has to A lot of it has to do with capitalism, so there's the good and the bad of that, right? Um, Also, places in Asia, Japan. We all know Japan benefited from the Marshall Plan in the 1940s, and since then they've created this very highly advanced technological country of goods. There's no restrictions on Japanese goods into the U.S., so they're very export oriented, and they have very low wages, but which gives them a very good advantage. And they became the tech and car geniuses that they are today. China, same thing. We talked about China a little bit. We're just kind of glazing over, just giving a few examples of what's occurring, and a lot of you already know this. In the 80s and the 90s and into the 2000s, China's planned economy, which we've talked about, gave way to a market economy, and so it becomes a major exporter of labor, goods, whatever you can think of, raw materials, and it's also an enormous market. So it's been made a very high destination of choice for a lot of foreign investment because there's just a lot of people there. And China also gives all of these benefits for you coming in and building factories and creating infrastructure, right? And it also became a member of the World Trade Organization recently. Is now by far the largest exporting giant in the world. Also, in the global economy, we have the OPEC nations, which is the Organization of Petroleum Export Countries. This is basically a cartel, which is a group of individuals getting together and sharing power. Which was established in the 1960s, but really took hold in early 1970s. And these are countries like Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, later Qatar, Libya, Indonesia, Abu Dhabi, Ecuador, so on and so on. All of these countries get into this organization of petroleum exporting countries, so they can really create a supply and demand for oil, right? This really came to a head. It's mostly Arab and Muslim countries for the most part, besides Ecuador. Um, but these are Arabs and mostly Muslim countries, and really the reason why they got together was they wanted to raise the price of oil together, right? And they did. In 1973, they actually had an embargo on the U.S. for helping Israel, and that quadrupled the price of oil from 1973 to 1975. And really, a lot of people argue that we're still in the throes of what happened in 1973. Before that, that's when gas was 5 cents a gallon. This is really, even since 1973, interrupted the price of oil, which, when the price of oil goes up, everything goes up, right? Not only gas, but food, transportation, everything that you can think of. When oil's more expensive, everything becomes more expensive because you have to transport it and you have to make it. Um, at the same time, we also get the European Union and NAFTA, and we've also talked about that, the pros and cons. Um, NAFTA was Bill and Hillary Clinton's idea, and that's with Canada and Mexico. It's the North American Free Trade Alliance. So basically, it created this system of no real borders between Canada and Mexico and America, and it's really created the world's second largest free trade zone behind the EU, and it's even into today, like we've talked about, there's pros and cons. A lot of people say this is the only way to bring prosperity to impoverished nations, to the developing world. Free trade is capitalism, and what happens with capitalism is democracy. Right? People become independent and they start being able to vote more, and their lives start changing for the better. And then a lot of the cons that we've already talked about. It diminishes sovereignty. Of local and national governments, and transfer power to things like the IMF or the World Trade Organization, right? A lot of people argue this takes power away from the governments, and what you have is these large banks and these large multinational corporations running the world. That's what some people argue is a con. a lot of people say rapid economic development is responsible for destruction of the environment, the widening gap between rich and poor, homogenization, which we already talked about, right? The Americanization of or the McDonaldization of the world, that consumer culture that was developed in the U.S. during the 1950s, like this. If any of you have watched Mad Men, that's kind of what Mad Men is about, and people argue this has been exported throughout the world. Pepsi, Coke, are still battling for a few places in the world they don't dominate. Fast food restaurants, etc., etc. But then on the pros, a lot of people argue that things that are specific to a country or region are traded because of this. For instance, I don't know, one I can think of off the top of my head is beer, right? We get Stellas or Beck's or Heineken, and these are all beers that are made in Europe, and we would never have these beers if it wasn't for free trade. I'm trying to think of other examples. There are other examples. I just can't think of any off the top of my head. And then people argue, but a lot of things have also become culturally and country specific. For instance, things like MTV are very country specific and very culturally specific. It's not just they're showing American MTV, they're creating an MTV for Britain, or they're creating an MTV for Germany, or an MTV for Nigeria. And so a lot of, like the McDonald's in Israel doesn't serve the same type of food as the McDonald's in Moscow, Idaho, right? They have different. The McDonald's in Russia has apparently marble, and Moscow, Russia is made of marble. Things like this. So a lot of people say, yeah, there is a homogenization, but at the same time, people are still very culturally, they still have a sense of culture. And this is an interesting discussion that I heard one man have. He says, what's happening in the EU is that the European Union is turning into what the United States is, and that is, they're starting to have the same type of money. You're starting to not have to use your passport. They're saying the lines between being French and German are closing every day, and the EU is really starting to homogenize itself and kind of everybody's kind of starting to speak English, and a lot of people are losing their cultural identity through the EU. And this guy argued, but what's happening in the United States is the exact opposite, right? He says it's a very interesting pattern. He says a lot of what is happening in the EU is what has already occurred in the United States, and what the United States is doing is they're turning more into what Europe used to be. Is for instance, he uses the example of medical marijuana, right? Some states are saying yes, some states are saying no, and this is a very big battle of healthcare, right? Some states are saying yes, we want the healthcare. Some people are saying no. Gay marriage, some states it's legal, some states it's not. So it's a very interesting dynamic, and this all has to do with what we've talked about in this whole idea of globalization and the world's getting smaller. And the argument is there are pros and cons to this, and the world is going through different stages of it as we speak, whereas the United States is becoming more culturally diverse. Europe and a lot of other places are becoming less culturally diverse, and this whole argument is this is the whole point of the world getting smaller. Things are changing. So that is our class, and I think this is the last slide, so I hope you enjoyed the class. If you have any questions about the PowerPoint or the last book review, please email me and I will answer them for you. And have a good winter break.